Okay, so I have the mark scheme right here for you to be able to see. There is a band 4, obviously the marks are out of 25, but at the moment, because you haven't done A2 yet, you're not going to get anywhere near high enough for that, so don't worry about that right now. What I would say to begin with is, so this section here, this is kind of your, I guess, your remembering section of the ladder that I gave you. The trouble with the way you've kind of just put it onto your page is it kind of feels almost redundant. This is helpful for you kind of in your head to mind map the things that you did, but you're kind of talking about, you looked at types of shots and camera movement, you looked at sound, you looked at semantic elements, which is great that you're using. So it says here relevant media terminology. You are, but they're potentially 3 different things that you could talk about in this assignment. So it seems like you've kind of just thrown that in there when it potentially is just wasting time. So these here could potentially be 3 paragraphs that you talk about separately. I don't think you necessarily need to really throw it in there in that first section. So you talk about watching specific examples of real media text, which is good, and you talk about the ideas you took, so you're applying it, and the ideas you took, such as the long-lasting shots edited to convey anticipation from the audience, and then you've given me a specific example from North by Northwest, which is good. So you are applying it to real media text, and then you've given me an example how you've used that in your own piece. So again, you're giving me relevant and specific examples, which is good. Down here, I would say it gets a little bit confusing. So you start talking about during the interview. Now, obviously, I've seen your coursework, so I know what you're talking about. But for someone who hasn't watched your video, because the examiner isn't going to also be the modifier for your coursework, okay, so there is like a 99.9% chance that this examiner has not seen your coursework and does not know what you're talking about. So when you talk about things like this, you need to really make it clear what that interview is. Okay, so I would make your example from your actual coursework much more specific. And again, you throw in, suggest that Mary, I would explain that she is I guess the protagonist. So just make that a little bit clearer. So although you are giving an example, it's not necessarily clear what you're trying to say. I would be much more analytical as well. So you talk about what you wanted to achieve, but you don't really kind of say whether or not you did achieve it. So you refer to your evaluation and the questions in your evaluations and the feedback that you got from your final piece as well, to kind of show whether or not it was successful, because you kind of go straight into when planning A2 trailer, but you haven't really said what you liked and what you didn't like. So you said the cutaways during the intro would be more interesting for the audience to watch. I believe that the use of cutaways would make it more interesting to watch. But then you don't really say you didn't use cutaways, so what was good about it without the cutaways? So you're telling me what you could have done, but you're not really analysing what you did do. So that needs some work, I would say. And then you do show progression, because when planning A2 coursework, I believe that would be useful looking into hybrid genres, wider use of semantic conventions. Again, you're using media terminology, but you're not talking necessarily about the same things that you were talking about here with your AS work. So there doesn't seem to be a consistent progression, although you're moving on to A2 and you've got that in there. It's almost like you've talked about the editing at AS, and then you're talking about something completely different at A2, because you start talking about semantic conventions and handheld shots, so you're talking about camera work. So you need to make sure your evaluation and your progress is still along the same lines as what you've been talking about previously, because this is looking quite long at the moment, so there's quite a few bits, like I said, like this bit, that's quite redundant. Once you condense that down, your next paragraph will then talk about something different. So you could then talk about semantic elements as your next paragraph, and then your camera work as your third paragraph. But at the moment, it feels like you're kind of weaving in and out and going off on a tangent, a bit like what we talked about in lesson. So in terms of the mark scheme, mostly clear. It is mostly clear, but like I said, there are times where it goes off on a tangent and it's not quite as obvious, especially, like I said, if the examiner doesn't know what you're talking about, hasn't seen your coursework. Progress is limited. You do move on to A2, but again, you're not really showing how you're going to improve, so that's kind of holding you back slightly. Your examples are described with discussion, and you are explaining why they're relevant. Okay, so where you apply real media text and then show how you use that, you're talking in relation to your outcomes. I would say your terminology is higher than basic. So your terminology is a capable use of terminology. So that is pushing into the band 3 level. But at the moment, the things that are holding you back are your clarity, your progression, and your evaluation. Okay, so as you can see in band 2, they don't mention evaluation at all, whereas band 3 you start seeing evaluated with clarity. So at AS we did this, at A2 we did this, it was better, worse, because. So it's still lacking that. So even at this stage you could be saying at AS we did this, at A2 we are going to do this. It could be better because, or it could end up being worse because. So if you'd done that, then you would be higher up into this band instead. But it is a good first attempt. We are going to carry on working on it. So what I'd like you to do is try and be more focused and specific. Remember what I said about just talking about one thing. Don't get carried away with trying to talk about everything, because that's when you start losing the clarity. But you are following the right structure. It is starting to have some shape to it, so well done.